I will be the host of today's talk. Before we get started, please make sure to turn off your cell phone or put them on the silent mode. Do you have a hobby? If you don't have a hobby, then maybe you should be sure to pay attention to the talk today. Eddie will be providing you with information about collecting hobby, sci-fi models. Honestly, I'm personally really interested in today's topic because my own hobby is making or seeing SF models. The title of today's talk is Painting Fantasy and Sci-Fi Models. Speaker Paul Starr is going to tell us about making some of these models. He will cover everything from the sculpture and casting process all the way up to the end product. He will focus on painting, miniatures, casting metal, or plastic. If you have any questions about today's talk, please write them down on the small sheets of paper you were given when you arrived. And raise your hand. Then one of the top volunteers can collect it for you. Paul will have a chance to answer your questions during the Q&A part of today's talk, which will be led by one of English-speaking volunteers. Now, without any further hesitation, please welcome Paul with a big round of applause.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. We're here today mostly to talk about painting sci-fi and fantasy models in a variety of scales, although I'm kind of focused on one. But first, just a little bit about me. I've been painting for about 16 years, sort of off and on. I've painted models as large as to about my knee to as smaller than your small nail. So there's a wide variety of scales. I've painted for some small independent movie kinds of projects. I've painted models for use in games, and I really enjoy it. I've never done this as a job. It's always been strictly a hobby for me. Well, I've had the opportunity to kind of turn it into a job from time to time. So, enough about those ones. So what are we going to talk about today? So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of miniature wargaming, which is really sort of the heart of where many of these models really sort of harken from. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of the contemporary miniature and wargaming scene and role-playing scene, what people do with these miniatures now. Then the meat of the presentation is really going to be about the art and craft of painting a science fiction or fantasy model. Within that, we're going to talk a little bit about sculpting, casting, the materials that go into the model. We're going to talk about the supplies you need. Then finally, we're going to get into a step-by-step of how I paint a model. So that may give you an idea of what this hobby might look like should you want to get involved. So, the history of miniature wargaming. As we saw in a GIC Talk 2 weeks ago, the history of gaming goes back very far, but the history of specifically miniature wargaming doesn't go back quite as far. This is a man by the name of Robert Louis Stevenson. You may know him. He's most famous for writing the novel, so to speak, Treasure Island. He is the first person to be documented to play something that is similar, at least, to what we would now call a miniature war game. So, in this magazine, dated 1898, there's a rather lengthy article about Robert Louis Stevenson and some friends of his using small miniature soldiers to reenact actual historical battles that took place. There's a little bit of discussion of the rules that they used, and they are dizzying, but we've come a long way since then. So what do people do with these models now? Mostly they play games. You can certainly paint a model and just have it sit on your shelf and enjoy the look of it, the aesthetic of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But many people will play games with these models, and they fall into a few broad categories. The games, at least, fall into a few broad categories. There are historical games. Amongst historical games, I've selected a couple. One of my favorites is a game called Legends of the Old West, in which all of your models are sort of cowboys, people from the old American West. This is a table setup that you might see in that game. It is light historical fiction. There are some historical characters that are modeled in this game, but in this game they're not overly worried about actually modeling historical things at specific events. There's also a 15mm war game called Flames of War. It's set in World War II. We have a fantastic setup here. This is not my work. This is somebody else. We have little tanks that are no bigger than this, very small tanks, and the people in this scale are so small that you can't hold them individually. You have to put them on a base and move a unit of people, a group of people, as opposed to one individual person. So then there's also sort of more modern war games. Within this category, there's Cold War Commander and Chain of Command. These are not my particular favorite games, but people certainly enjoy them. Again, these are much more modern. Both of these games focus on contemporary wars that are going on essentially right now or very recently. For me, I don't care for these games. They just cut a little too close to home. I'd rather my little guys that are sort of fighting on the table be a little more distant from me in time or space or reality. Then there's science fiction games. Whew. And there are a lot of science fiction games. We're going to talk about two specifically. Really, the biggest game by far that people play with these models is called Warhammer 40K. It's set in a far distant sort of dystopian future where there's aliens and a vast empire of humanity that's sort of struggling to survive against aliens encroaching on all sides. So you'll have tanks and these ginormous aliens and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I've played this game and have really enjoyed it. And if you're looking to play a miniature war game, it is probably easiest to find an opponent, to find another player for this game than really any other. There's also a game called Mercs, which is set in a nearer future than Warhammer 40K. It's definitely Earth, and for this game, the world has sort of been taken over by sort of large corporations. Governments have sort of fallen away, and there's sort of corporate structures that sort of own the world. With when playing Mercs, you're only going to have 5 models against 5 models. So I will have 5 dudes, and your opponent will have 5 dudes, and you'll sort of maneuver your guys around the table and try to claim space. Then there's fantasy games. There are quite a few fantasy games. Amongst fantasy games, the biggest by far is a game called Warhammer Fantasy. It is by the same company that puts out Warhammer 40K. And the models will sort of rhyme. There are orcs in Warhammer Fantasy and there are orcs in Warhammer 40K. But this is a game where you'll have a very large number of models, 200, 300 models on the table, all fighting over whatever fantasy guys like to fight about. And then War Machine, which is sort of a steampunk kind of game. It's definitely fantasy. There's lots of magic, there's elves and dwarves and that kind of thing. But there's also these large steam-powered, magic-powered golem things that roll around the table. A lot of fun to paint. I played the heck out of that game too. And then Dungeons and Dragons, or role-play games in general, which is what I use most of these models for. Most typically, I run a Dungeons and Dragons game, and we get a lot of use out of these models. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the art and craft of the models themselves. Specifically, we're going to start with sculpting. So most models will begin their life as what is affectionately known as green stuff. It's this sort of two-part epoxy putty. You'll cut a little ribbon off of this, and it's some green and some yellow, and you'll mix it together with your fingers. You'll work it, and eventually it will turn into this nice green color. And you can work with it with the right tools to shape really anything you want to make. It's used primarily because when you go to make a mold, this material will withstand the pressures and the heat and the other concerns that are involved in the making of the mold. So this is an example. I did not sculpt this. Sculpting is not a talent that I particularly have, although I have profound respect for sculptors. Here's another fantastic sculpt. So this is what the original model would look like. So after you've got that original green, we would call it, that original model, you're going to, well, but not necessarily you, but whoever it is that's going to produce the models, is going to make a mold. Almost all molds are going to be this sort of sandwich mold situation. So there's going to be a hard rubber bottom plate and then another plate that's going to go on top of that. And those two pieces of rubber will create a cavity in which you can then pour hot metal or liquid plastic or resin, a whole wide variety of materials. So this is what the models are going to look like when they come right out of the mold. So they've got all of this extra material there that kind of helps the casting process. That material isn't wasted, at least in metal it's not wasted. They will chop all that extra bit off and then melt that down again and pour it. So that's kind of gives you an idea of how we go from a green model that's just been sculpted into more of a metal model that might be more like what you're going to paint. But there's lots of other materials too, not just metal. There's resin, it's fairly popular. There's all kinds of plastics, polymers that you can cast in. And if you're really feeling saucy, you can cast in chocolate. I wouldn't paint this. It looks quite delicious. I have cast things in chocolate before as part of gifts that I've given people. But if you want to, go for it. This looks like a delicious project. So some of the basic supplies that you're going to need for painting miniatures. There's really not a whole lot you need for the very base level. But first, you're going to need a hobby knife. You're going to need a sharp blade. Preferably it comes to a nice point. And this will be what you use to sort of clean the extra bits off the model. We'll talk about that process in a little bit. But there's always going to be some amount of cutting that you're going to need to do on a model. Some bit of adjustment that's going to be required. Because when they come right out of the mold, they're a little bit messy. You're also going to need brushes. You're going to live and die by brushes. There's a wide variety of shapes and sizes to brushes, but I really live in that small space between 3 and 0 is really where I live. Anything above a 3 is just not useful for me. So most of my work is going to be done with actually this brush right here. This size 0 brush is going to be most of my painting is going to be done with this. The vast majority. Every now and again I'll go to a size 1 or a size 2 if I have a large area that I'm working with for whatever reason. Say somebody's got a long cloak, some large surface area to work with, but most of the time it's going to be this size 0 brush. And it's not because I want the bristles to be short, it's because I want them to come to a nice sharp point. This could have very long bristles and that would be okay, but it's really about how small of a point does that brush come to. And size 0 is sort of the sweet spot. If I get any smaller than that, the brush doesn't hold as much paint as I would like it to, because I'm working. So I tend to go with size 1 or 0. Files. So often, especially if you're working with a miniature that is cast in metal or in resin, you will need some files. We'll talk about what you're going to do with those files. We've got a set of files here that you can peruse at your leisure later. And of course, you're going to need paint. There is paint obviously in a wide variety of materials. Almost all the paint that I work with is acrylic paint. There are people who paint miniatures in oils, but that is a much bigger hassle than I'm willing to go to. Acrylic paint is just a lot easier to work with. It's much easier to clean. If it gets somewhere that it's not supposed to, I can clean up that mess very quickly. If I'm working with oils, it's a very different situation. There's acrylic paints made by thousands of manufacturers around the world in more colors than you can probably imagine. I use primarily Reaper brand paint and Games Workshop paint, but we'll talk about paint a little bit later. And finally, you're going to need miniatures. You need people to paint. Miniatures are made by so many different companies in so many different genres. It's kind of unfathomable. You can find miniatures for everything from sort of historical Napoleonic guys to far future guys. Most of these models have been used in a Dungeons and Dragons game that I run. Except for this guy right at the this is not working. Except for this guy at the very far end. Haven't used him yet. He's from a gentleman named Andy Hawk. He has a whole universe of extremely weird miniatures that he puts together. And this is sort of I don't even know what to call him, but he's a weird guy. So let's talk about how I paint a miniature. This is not to say this is the only way to paint a miniature in any way, shape, or form. This is just how I choose to do it. Lots of other painters will go lots of different directions with a model, but this is just my process, and if you would like to join this process, this might give you an idea of how to start. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to prepare a miniature, which will vary based on the material that it's cast in. Then you're going to need to base coat the model, sort of putting on the very basic colors, just coloring in the lines, so to speak. Then you're going to use some ink or some washes to help bring out some depth to the model. And then finally, you're going to do some highlighting. So let's talk about what you do to prepare a miniature. As we talk about painting a model, we're going to use this model in particular. This is a model named Michelle. She's from a company called Reaper Miniatures, which is based in Texas. They make a whole wide variety of fantasy models, a little bit of science fiction. But I chose this model because she's got enough detail that you can see what's happening with the model, but there's not so much detail that you're just sort of overwhelmed with it. She's a good basic painting tutorial kind of model. And she's a strong female character, which are sometimes lacking in this sort of broader dork culture that we've got. So this is the model we're going to use. Preparing the model. So often with resin or metal models, there's going to be this sort of extra material hanging on to the side. All this extra stuff just kind of hanging out here. And that's called flash. It's just part of the casting process. When those two parts of the sandwich come together and the material gets squirted in there, sometimes where those sandwiches meet, there's going to be a little bit of extra material that sort of leaks out. So you're going to want to shave all that down with your hobby knife. You're going to want to clean all that stuff off. And then there's also mold lines, and you're going to want to clean those either if you've got plastic, you're going to want to use a hobby knife, or you may use a file to shave that down a little bit. As a note on scale, as we look at the pictures here, it's very easy to say, oh, that's huge. That's super easy to see. It's very easy to work with. This line here is thinner than a human hair. This looks like a huge line going down this person's shin. That is very, very small in reality. So we'll talk about that. You're going to wash your models, especially if they're plastic. And then you're going to want to prime your models if they're resin or metal. So you'll want to wash your plastic models because there's often a lubricant that's used in the mold to make getting getting the model out of the mold that much easier. But that same lubricant will get in the way of the paint actually heating to the model. So you want to wash all that stuff off. And primer is the same kind of situation. So with many materials of the model, you need some primer. And what primer is going to do is it's going to grab onto that model really good. It's going to hold onto the surface really nicely, and the paint will be able to hold on to the primer. If you put paint directly on a metal model, it will stay for a while, but eventually it will fall off. And you don't want to invest all the time and effort and energy and creativity into something that's just going to fall apart later. So it's best to, typically it's best to prime. So what do we do specifically for Michelle? Michelle's made of a material that doesn't need primer. It's a little unique in that respect, but it definitely needs to be washed. So this is me washing Michelle in my sink at home. And you just get in there with a toothbrush and some warm soapy water and get all of that lubricant off of there. There's also going to be some mold lines that you're going to need to remove here. And actually one or two that I missed on this model. See if you can spot them as we go along. So the very first step in actually painting the model, once you've got it all done, is you're going to base coat. So base coating is basically just coloring in the lines. So making all of the parts of the model the essential color that they're going to be when you finish. So I always start with skin tones. The reason I start with skin tones is because it tends to be the deepest part of the model. That is to say, if you look at this model, there's the skin and then there's cloth over that, and then there's some hair in the way. Well, if I've got a brush and I'm navigating in a narrow space, it's very easy to hit those areas that are higher. So I'll start working on the lower areas because if I have to go back and hit those areas later, I'll get those raised areas. I'm going to paint over those later. I'm not worried about it so much. So I start with skin tones. Skin is always difficult to get right on a model. We look at human faces and human skin all the time. There's a dozen people or more here in the audience. I can see all of your faces. I see faces all over the place. Everyone does. We all know what a human face looks like very, very intimately. So if you get it wrong in a model, it's really obvious, right? We don't really see swords very often. We don't necessarily see metal armor very often. So if your color is not exactly right on that, you've got a little bit of leeway. The viewer will give you a little bit of forgiveness. But skin has to be just right. So after I've done some skin, thankfully Michelle doesn't have very much skin, so she's a little easy in that regard. So then I'll go on and I'll do the next deepest layer. In this instance, it's all of the sort of under armor parts of the model. I decided to go with a blue here. I wanted that to contrast a red that I went with for the armor later. You can see I've actually missed a little bit on her arm. As her arm comes up, I've actually missed a small bit up there, but it's very easy to come back later and add some more. After that, all of the parts of the model that I want to be leather, and all of the parts that are going to be metallic, essentially the swords here, I've also gone over in black. That's because when I paint them later with the actual metallic colors, it will help those metallic colors pop a little bit more if I've done them in black first. So then I'll move on. Then I moved on to the reds. I wanted all the armor to be red. I think just before I painted this model, I'd watched an episode of a particular episode of Game of Thrones in which a character in red armor makes a very prominent appearance, and I think that sort of stuck with me. So I wanted red armor for this character, so just put the red on there and sort of get in between the lines. At this point, if I've made a mistake, if I've gone over with my red into one of the blue areas, it's very easy to go back and just add a little blue and get back where I need to be. Add some slate gray for the cloak. Again, at this point, we're still just putting the basic colors where they go. Nothing terribly fancy at this point. Here's the back side of the cloak. So then I've gone in and done a lot of extra details here. So I used some silver paint on the swords. I've done all the hair at this point, the little hair tie, all the little odds and ends that didn't really get roped into anywhere else. Just go through and tap all those. So at this point, the base coat is finished. The first real work of the painting is done. This is the finished base coat. The model, it starts to look decent at this point. You can look at this and say, okay, yeah, I see what's happening here. But in my opinion, this model is still very flat, maybe a little cartoony. So what we're going to do next is we're going to apply some ink. And what ink is going to do, it's labeled wash here, but what ink is going to do, it's very thin, it's as thin as water. And it's going to flow into the recessed parts of the model. So, for instance, if I'm a miniature, imagine I'm a little person and I'm holding onto this bottle. If you're painting me, there's all of my fingers are all separate pieces, and then there's this little space where you might see the bottle. Well, the wash or the ink will flow into this recessed areas between my fingers and make my fingers very distinctly individual things. Without the wash, it's very hard to see that kind of detail. And then later we'll go back and highlight the raised areas. So this is our base coated model again, the same picture you saw before. A little bit flat, not much going on there. But then if we hit it with wash, if we do it with ink, some of the detail really starts to pick up a little bit. I'll switch back to that first image again. So again, this is the base coated model, nothing terribly fancy, but when we add the ink, we can really start to see, especially in the armor, we really start to see some detail in the hair, in the face. This was the brown ink that I used on this model, almost exclusively brown ink. I like brown ink because it will add depth to the model, it will darken the lower parts of the model, but it's not so dark as to make the whole thing just black again. And when you're done with the model, it'll give it a slightly more realistic feel than a black ink or a gray ink. The model might feel just slightly dirty, but it feels a little more real. It feels a little more human. So after we've done all of our inking, we move into the highlight phase, which is really where the model starts to pop. It really just begins to feel like a living, breathing thing a little bit at this point. So I start again with the face, again because it's the deepest area and it's the hardest part to get right. I'd rather spend more time with this than other parts if I need to. So I've gone back in with that same color that I started with and highlighted a little bit. Then a couple of lighter colors after that. So you can see her face is beginning to take some shape. We can see a lot more detail and it work on the eyes a little bit. Eyes are a challenge at this scale. Getting a small bit of paint into it's just so incredibly small. It's easy to look at this model and say, we've got this eye situation here. Her eye that's further away from me, I didn't much like, and I would love to go back and fix it, but looking at this, it's like, oh, well, that's very easy, but you got to remember the entire model is this size. So the idea of going in and changing, it'd be very easy to go in and change it. Not as much. Not as much. Kind of challenging. So this is the kind of mistake that I'm willing to just kind of let happen. There are people who would go in and fix that, and more power to them, but I choose sanity. So we've got our eyes and our skin going. She has a face that begins to look something more like a human face, even with that weird eyeball. So then I went in and did the grays on the cloak and the leather. I wanted black leathers for the gloves and sort of the skirt kind of area. But the thing is, just straight black doesn't read as black. If I were to look at anything in this room that's black, it's not going to be a solid black thing as my eye sees it. There's going to be some variations of gray, hints of color in there. It's It's just how it's going to be. It's going to be the same situation with models. If it's a flat black, just deep black, it's not going to read. You're not going to see any of the detail. So I've gone over, you can see here in the glove a little bit, there's some detail here that I've gone over with some lighter grays that help bring out some of those things. So at this point, I knew I really wanted a character with a nice bright red armor, but not pink. I really did not want pink for this model at all. Pink just is a little too girly. When I look at this model, she's definitely a woman, but she is not girly in any way, right? She's very serious about her job. So I did not want pink. So adding in some more highlights for the armor, I went one step too light in my red and ended up at pink. In my opinion, this gets into pink territory. I did not want that. So it's easy to fix. I decided I'd address that later. We'll talk about how I fix the pinks later. But basically, at this stage, all I'm doing is I'm adding in thin layers of slightly brighter colors to add a little more depth to the model. So the raised areas, I'm going to add more bright color to. The lower areas, I'm going to leave mostly dark. So we've still got our pink armor here, but I wanted to deal with the hair and that tie. Hair is pretty straightforward, so is the tie. Then I wanted to make sure I made those swords look somewhat sharp. So there is a little bit of a beveled edge on those swords. And so I went through and put a lighter shade of silver on the edges of those swords to help make them look a little sharper, make them look less like baseball bats and a little more like a sword. Oh, coming back from pink. So let's skip back. We have our very pink armor here that just bothers me. So what I did was I took the very first color of red that I put on this model and I mixed it with a little bit of water. Made it very, very thin, right? Then I washed that back over the armor that we have. It's not an opaque amount of paint that I'm putting on at this point. It's just enough to barely stain the surface of the model. And what that did was it took the very brightest highlights, those pink highlights, and pulled them back towards red and got us out of Barbie land. So she looks a little more like, well, a little more like what I was hoping she would look like. And so this is what I would consider to be sort of the finished product for this model. We've got all of our colors in the right place. There's highlights where they need to be. She's looking pretty good at this point. At this scale, doesn't necessarily look quite as awesome as I would like. But again, when you're talking about a model that's this size, it's very easy to see this model on the table and sort of say, okay, that's pretty good. There are some things that I would certainly change about this model if I would add this model to paint again. The biggest thing is there's still a mold line right here along the leg. Oh, it kills me. Oh, every time I see this, I go, oh, why? Why are you there? But when it's just plain white material like this, which is what we started with, it's often hard to see those very fine little details, those mold lines hiding in there waiting for you. If I had this model to paint again, I would make sure I get that mold line. And there's also that eye that's largely hidden by her hair at this point that's a little bit wonky. I would change that too. That's basically where we're at. So this gives you an idea of sort of the finished product and the basic procedure that I go through when I'm painting a model. It also gives you an idea of what the models go through before they get to you, how they're sculpted, how they're cast, the different materials, and in very broad strokes, sort of a history of how these models might be used. So at that point, I will hand it over to my good friend.